Hello everybody and welcome to part 1 of the Toolbox series where we're going to be edge jointing this timber. Let's get going. Okay, so this is the third project in the free online woodworking school and is the third project that includes a little bit of edge jointing. In the first project, we edge jointed the box lid together. In the second project, we edge jointed the sides of the cabinet together. And in this one, we're also going to be edge jointing the sides. In the previous two videos, I've showed you two different techniques to produce a nice, clean, invisible edge joint. And in this one, I'm going to show you a third. Now, this one is my go-to method, and it's worth saying now that in this episode, we are going to cover the edge jointing and the gluing all in one hit. Therefore, if you feel that we've glossed over certain steps of this, then it's recommended you go back and watch the dovetail box edge jointing video or the cabinet edge jointing video. So what we're going to do to start with is get our piece of timber and work out what orientation we want them. So for this piece, we've got some narrow grain in the middle. Looks quite nice, and you can see there's sort of a light fade going on. Alternatively, I can have it going this way, where we've got the wider grain in the middle. This is a more realistic view. If this was one solid board, you would most likely see curved grain in the middle like that. You would be very, I'm not going to say it's impossible, because you never know with wood, but that is a much more unrealistic edge joint. However, I like the look of it, so I'm going to stick with it. And once you've got an orientation you like, don't forget you can flip it around end to end. So once you're happy with it, we're going to do a big old triangle across both components and then label both of them. In this case, this is actually spare because I've already labeled the other components. And if you want to know why I've stacked the timber up like this with air between each layer, have a look at the introduction I've done to this project if you haven't already. There's a link to it popping in the corner now. I cannot emphasize how important it is you do this. Oh, before we get stuck in, it's also worth saying that all of these components are slightly oversized at the moment, because the way we're going to do this is edge joint them and then cut them to size after gluing. Do not cut them to size prior to gluing, because if there's any slight misalignment, which there will be, you will have to trim it down flush, therefore making the box smaller than intended. So firstly, cut them slightly oversized, about 50 mil or so is fine. Then we'll glue them together and then cut the ends to length afterwards. Okay, and once you've got all of your sides laid out and you know what's going to be the front, the back, the left and the right and everything like that, we can now move on to edge jointing. Before I show you this new technique, let's quickly revise on the two that I've showed you previously. So the first technique I showed you in the dovetail box project involved simply clamping the piece upright in the vise like that and then flattening it without the use of any other guides. What we did was we put a camber on this plane blade and then planed slightly biased to the left or right hand side to allow that camber to take off more material on one side than the other, thus squaring it up. So this method of squaring up an edge is by far the simplest, however I would say probably the hardest, because it relies on good balance of the plane, good pressure throughout the cut, and also when you're doing it you need to have a very strong mental vision of what the wood is actually doing underneath the plane in order for you to work out where's high and where's low without constantly checking it. So there's quite a lot that goes into it, which is why in the cabinet project I showed you this method. And so this method involved getting the two components you wanted to edge joint together and then folding them round like a book and putting that in the vise. And once you've got them level and everything like that, we then plane both of them simultaneously. And therefore, if there was a slight angle on it, it wouldn't matter, because when you fold it round, both those angles on either of the components cancel themselves out. The issue with this, however, is if you fold it round and you realise, oh, there's a gap there, I need to get it back in, you've then got to go through that whole process of getting them realigned in the vise, make sure they're level and everything like that, and if they're not, then you take a shaving and then it's all off on one side and you basically got to start the process again. And so we essentially established that although being perceived as a trick of the trade, it's actually quite an annoying process and it doesn't work as well as you'd expect. So next, it brings us on to the third one. And this one is my chosen method of edge jointing material at least 95% of the time. And this method includes making a long grain shooting board, which is what this bit of plywood is doing on my bench. Essentially what we're going to do with this is use the plane on its side and take advantage of the fact that the edge of the plane is square. So if we do that, we can be absolutely certain that this is 90 degrees, but in order to do that, you need to ensure that this surface is absolutely flat. My workbench has got a few dips and bumps in it and stuff, so I prefer to put it on something like this. It's also got a finish on it as well, so it's quite nice and slick as well, which is quite good. And the setup for this is very simple. We've got our two edges that we need to join, these internal faces. We're going to pick one of them, and obviously if we're to use the plane on its side, we need to ensure this is elevated up somewhat to allow the blade to actually contact it. We'll just use the other component for that. I firstly need to get this clamped down, but I can see there's a bit of a cup on this material. You can see it rocking like that. So I'm going to flip it over end to end. So I'm still edge jointing that same side, but it's now with the bridge down and it's a lot more solid. However, that bottom one is now bumping all over the place. So if I just flip that over as well, there we go, that's better. So that's nice and stable, and we'll get some clamps on it. And obviously I'm making the most of my split top Roubo to do this. However, there's loads of ways you can clamp material. You'll just have to work it out according to your own setup. But if you've got a split top Roubo, you're going to find this much easier. And so with that setup, we're now going to take some through shavings with the plane. But all while doing this, I'm just being absolutely certain that this plane is resting on this surface and is securely resting on this surface. It's not tipping or anything like that. It needs to be firmly planted in like that to ensure we're getting a nice, straight, consistent cut. All right, and after a few passes, I'm getting one continuous shaving that is an entire width all the way along. So that's what we're looking for to start with. Now we need to start focusing on that spring joint. Again, this is something that was mentioned in the dovetail box and cabinets. So if you don't know the reason why, that'll be linked below on the free Online Woodworking School website. But essentially we're looking to create a dip like this along the length of it. Not that exaggerated though, very, very subtle. So the way we do that is by taking a short shaving, sort of about that long. Then we're going to do a slightly longer one, sort of about that long, then a slightly longer one, and then we'll start and stop about 10 millimeters shy of either end to produce a very, very shallow dip on this component. So starting midway, lift off, slightly longer one, lift off, slightly longer one, lift off, and then this final one. Oh, little jump there, let's try that again. And lift off just before hitting the end. Sorted. So there is now a very, very subtle curve in that. And there's various ways you can test this. For me, I put it in the vise, I get a straight edge, I place it on top. And what I do is I push it on the end here, and what I should feel is it rubbing on both of these high points. So let's give that a go. You can hear it, look. That's it rubbing on both sides. If we get the other one, which we haven't done anything to, and I bet will be high in the middle. You see that pivoting in the middle, particularly there? It's not as bad as I thought it would be, but it's definitely pivoting in the middle. It's not biting as much. So that indicates to me that there's a high point here that we want to get rid of. So let's get that one sorted out now. Now I can see on this that the grain is traveling towards me. So if I plane this way, I'm going to get some severe tear out. So I need to make sure I'm going the other way. Or I could just flip it over and plane with the grain this way. However, that's where I'm going to start dealing with this cupping, which I don't really want. So I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to go from the other way. Ooh. Nice. So this is what we're looking for in an edge joint. Completely invisible gap with not a lot of pressure from either side. You can see it just takes a little bit of a pinch for me to close up that gap, and that's all it takes. Similarly, you should be able to flip it over and check the other side is also gap free, which it is. There's just a slight shadow caused by a difference in thickness. I obviously forgot to put that through the machine once, but sod it. I'll plane that down flush after it's all assembled. But anyway, that's what a good quality edge joint should look like, or I guess I should say shouldn't look like, because it's invisible. This level of detail and finesse I'm going for is just something that I like to do. But if you don't find enjoyment on that and you just want to get this toolbox jointed together, don't worry about making it invisible. You can take this edge straight off of a machine planer or a thicknesser, and that gap will be pretty good. However, there will be slight choppy marks in it from that machine, which is what I cleaned up with the plane in this instance in order to make it invisible. If you don't do that, you might end up with a small line, but if you want to go for this level of detail, go for it. But if you don't, don't. So I'm going to continue working on these, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so that's all the edge joints done. So next we're going to move on to gluing. But just to summarize all of this, long-term viewers of the channel will know what I'm about to say. Sharp tools, finely set plane. That is what you need in order to be successful at this stage, to do it quickly and easily. If just one of those things is not right, then this step is going to be an absolute nightmare. So make sure your tools are sharp, make sure it's finely set, and be patient, I guess would be the third one. Right, let's glue. Well, not quite actually. We need to do a quick dry fit first. Let's do these one by one. We should only need 3 clamps to do this. Get it all aligned. Obviously these components are a little bit cupped at this point, so I just want to make sure that top surface is nice and flush. There we go. So one there, get this one all lined up. It's also worth saying that that line you see going down the center is actually, it's a small step, but if I shade it, then it completely disappears. So before you call me out on that. Anyway, that's that one done. So we're going to do the rest of them one by one and double check they're all okay before putting the first layer of glue on any of these. Okay, so the 4 sides are dry, so we need to get flattening these off and cutting them to size. Now in the previous series, I've showed you how to do this step entirely by hand, but in this one I want to cover the machine method for it. So if you're at this stage and you only have hand tools, you're going to need to go back and watch those ones. They're all linked in the description below, so they're easy to find. But yeah, I wanted to cover the machine method this time. Also, it's a big component. I can't be bothered to flatten it by. So firstly, what I would recommend you do is get them all laid out in the bench in the order and orientation you want to have them. At the moment, we've got the triangle on there, but you don't have to follow that at this point. If you're having second thoughts, you could flip it over and make this the outside face if you want. So we're going to get this in the order that's required. Side, front, side, back. And, you know, just experiment at this point, see what you can do. So in this case, that actually works better because the grain is arcing in this direction across all of them. This one, if I flip it that way, then it's doing the same thing and we actually get more of a continuous grain going on. So in this case, actually, those triangles are going to be on the back, on these long components at least, and then on the front ones, it works with them this way. However, saying that, I picked these faces for a reason. So actually, what if I flip these round instead? Because the side's like, you know, not as important as the front, is it? Yeah, I'll tell you what, actually, that works better. That's much better. So, you know, it's not perfect, but look at the sort of sweep on this grain, and then it's continuing off to the other one here. Same again there. Same again on this side. Well, not as much there, I suppose. There's a little bit of a defect here, but yeah, we'll work with that. But that's kind of what I'm looking for things to flow over the corners nicely. And of course, right at the start of this project, if you're cutting the timber to size, you can start with this in mind, with having continuous grain around the whole box. I haven't done it here because all of this is made up from scrap oak from my stock, so I haven't actually got any continuous grain that I can take advantage of. But if you're buying it in long lengths, definitely take advantage of it because it's a great way to get grain consistency and colour consistency as well. The next thing to establish is if I want this to be the top of the box or if I want this to be the top of the box. Again, I'm looking at this, I think this is going to be the bottom. So we're going to do a big old face side and face edge mark on all of these. And this will overwrite the previous markings that we did with the triangle because, you know, as we said, that triangle is no longer relevant. We're going to be working from these face sides and edges for now. Okay, next we need to get that face edge flat, and we're obviously going to do that on the planer this time, or the jointer for you imperial folk across the pond. So to plane this edge square, we're obviously going to need to get it up against the fence like this. However, at the moment, we've got some beads of glue resting on that fence, meaning it's not actually sitting flat on there. So before we flatten that edge, we need to flatten the initial face side. Now, fortunately, my planer is wide enough to handle this entire board in one pass. However, if yours is not, you could, of course, cut it down to slightly oversized first to allow it to get over the planer, square off an edge, and then cut it to size after that. You know, you don't need to keep it at full size now. It could just be trimmed off a little bit if you want. Oh, and if you can't do that, you're going to need to do it by hand, unfortunately. Sorry. So I do have a video out there already showing you how to use a planer jointer correctly. So that'll be linked in the description below. But for now, obviously all I'm doing is just making sure that guard is as low as possible, well, not as low as possible. Basically, I get it to the point where the board can fit underneath, but my fingers can't alongside the board. I mainly use this thing as a warning. As soon as my hands touch that, I know that I'm in the danger area and I need to be a little bit more careful. I also keep a little wet rag to hand just to wet my hands so that when I'm doing this, I've got more grip. There's nothing worse than having dry hands when pushing something over this, especially that wide, and it starts slipping out your hands. So just a little bit of moistness gives you that extra grip. So when you see the hand marks on camera, it is not my sweaty hands. And the way we're going to do this is keep fingers tucked away, push it over, going to push it through, and as soon as we can get a hand on that opposite side, we're going to do so, putting most of the pressure on this hand now, and then when we can get the second hand on, feed it from the opposite side. That way you're not going to be tempted to push it from behind or anything like that. Just try and keep both hands planted on this side. However, saying that, I've told people that in the past and they've tried to get both hands on the opposite side when it's like this, and that is quite dodgy. Like, you want to make sure you can get 2 full hands on there. So one like that, next one like that. I think the important thing for me is don't go in there like Spider-Man like that, because you're not going to get any grip like this, because you've got 10 digits to look after then, whereas if you tuck everything away and you just use your palms, you've only got 2 limbs to look after then, so it's just less to handle. And there you go, that's how we're looking after the first pass. So no join line to be seen whatsoever, and that resonates across all of them. I think I'm going to have to reevaluate the order as well, because I'm looking at this one and I've actually managed to book match it, so that's going to make a really nice front. Yeah, I'm looking at this now. I forgot that I actually book matched all of these sides, and so I'm going to line them all up with the center line on this component here that I've just marked out, and just transfer those measurements across, so I haven't got to measure it out each time. Do that from both sides, link those lines up with a ruler on each component, and then we can be sure to keep that book match nice and central on each of these sides. And then we're going to freehand these lines on the bandsaw. The reason we're freehanding it is because there's no guarantee this line is parallel to the side of the material. Therefore, I cannot use this fence. And I'm going to cut about 3mm away from either line so that we can take it down to final size later and remove the rough saw marks from the bandsaw. Right, and obviously by slicing off those sides, I have lost the face edges for the most part. So, I mean, on this case, I've got the face side that's showing me where the face edge is, so that's okay. But that's the thing at this stage. It's so early on that you've got flexibility at this point, that you don't get all the answers straight away. I guess the main thing this demonstrates is just paying attention to the material as it evolves and as you start uncovering the sort of inner beauty within the grain. Just focus on that and make decisions now that you know you're not going to regret later down the line. And so although I'm having to remark a few things out, I'm going to be very happy with the end result. I don't doubt it. So next I'm going to start cleaning up that face edge at the bottom, and to do that we obviously need to get it up against the fence like this. Now this setup at the moment will work. I'll just move that back and we plane it over like that. However, I'm having to lean over the machine quite a bit. So what I actually do when I'm doing edge jointing like this is I bring this all the way forward and I bring the fence forward like this as well. That way I'm not off balance when I'm doing this. The only exception to this is when I'm edging plywood and other abrasive timbers. I tend to use that part of the block just because it tends to degrade the cutters, and I don't want to wear down a section in the middle here that causes a big stripe in any timber that goes over it afterwards. So abrasive stuff here, but then most other things kind of up this end. And once that's all locked down, of course, we'll lower this block as well. There's no point having it exposed here. Get that in a little bit closer, why not? And then there we go, that's a really nice setup we've got there now. There's not a chance I can get any fingers down there when the timber's in place. And my method for doing this is knuckles into the edge of the timber to push it into the fence. No fingers down like this, just because there's no need for it. Tuck everything away, and then I've got this hand on top that's going to do the main pushing and keep it down into the table. So it'll be going across like that. Okay, so that gives us a face and an edge that are all planed up and square now, so we've just got to get the remaining 2 sides down to the same thing. And there's 2 routes you can go about this. If, like me, your thicknesser is able to accommodate this entire thing within the capacity of the machine, do that first. We want to plane this edge down to the required width, then focus on this face. Because if we do this first, it's going to make this thinner, therefore it's going to be harder to stand up on ends to do this face. However, if your thicknesser is unable to fit it upright like this, I would recommend doing this flat face first, and then either trimming this remaining side down using a table saw, if you've got one of them, or by using the panel sizing methods by hand that I showed you in the cabinet series and also in the dovetail box series. So again, linked below should you need access to any of them. But for me, I can just about fit this in the thicknesser, so that's how I'm going to do it. This edge first, and then clean up these faces. Damn, I'm 5mm off. Right, well it looks like I'm doing this face first and then I'll do the edges using hand tools. Damn it! So yeah, obviously if I had a table saw by this point, it would be very easy to trim that down to width and it would be nice and accurate. However, I don't have one in this workshop. And by the way, if you want to know more about that, there's a link in the description to a blog that I wrote that discusses the difference between having a bandsaw or having a table saw, and hopefully it justifies why I don't have a table saw in here. But saying that, I am quite lacking one in this instance. I do have a plunge saw, but it's actually going to be quite difficult to ensure this stays parallel by using a plunge saw, even with a guide rail. So using the face edge at the bottom, I'm going to measure up how far I want to go on each side and give myself a little knife mark bang on that point. We're then going to connect those two lines using a longer ruler and the same knife. Got to be careful with this that it doesn't track the grain, of course. So my method for doing this is to start at the bottom here, do a very light pass, and then gradually extend that line all the way up. Traditionally, people would do this with what's called a panel gauge, which is basically a giant marking gauge. However, I don't actually own one that is big enough to do this distance. I showed you in a previous video how to make one, but to be honest, I've actually found this method to be a little bit more accurate and easier as well, not to mention accessible to people. So I've got a nice line going all the way along there at the required width. Let's repeat that on all three of them. And we're going to get this set up using the exact same method that we used to edge joint the material by creating a long grain shooting board. Now I'm going to use a jointer plane for this. No reason why, I just feel like using it this time. You'd have noticed earlier that I did the edge jointing with a smoothing plane. Over this distance, a smoothing plane could just about handle that, I reckon. But I'm just using the jointer plane this time because a little bit of extra mass won't go amiss. So on the far end here, you'll notice that I've only got a couple of millimeters to go, not long at all. However, on this end, I've got a little bit more to do. So my aim with this is to get it to the same distance I've got over here, but all the way along. Once I've got that consistent offset, that's where I'm going to take the long shavings all the way through to ensure that it's nice and flat along that edge, while also being sure that I'm not approaching the line quicker on one side than I am the other, and obviously making adjustments as I go. But that's the overall aim. Get it to a consistent offset, and then take long shavings to take it back to the final width. Still approaching a little quicker here, so I'll just do some short shavings on this side. There we go, and carry on with the through shavings. So there you go, by the time you stand them up on end, they should all be exactly the same length, but you need to be absolutely certain that on the bottom of all these you have got that initial face edge mark that we marked earlier. It's especially important you've got that mark there for the next stage where we're going to be cutting these down to length. So let's do that now. So the first thing we're going to do is put a knife line up one end of this board, and we're going to do that as close as we can, you know, like a millimeter in or something like that to this edge. That means we can then measure out and cut the remainder off to the final size. A couple of ways you can do this. You could do it with a large square, like I've got here. This is a great way of doing it. However, if you don't have something quite as fancy as that, you could just go for a normal square and then extend it with a nice high quality ruler, and that will give you the same thing. So I'm just double checking that this is the face edge as indicated by the marking. We're going to put the square against that face edge, get it close to the end of the timber, push the stock in nice and firmly, and then scribe a line up with a knife. And we'll do that on one end of each component first before cutting the opposite side down to length. Next, we're going to get the shooting board out and plane that side down to the line. And what we need to be certain of here is that that face edge is pressed against the fence. You do not want to be referencing the opposite side off the face edge. Again, previous videos will tell you why, and we're going to plane back to that line on the side. It might be that your line is on the opposite side, depending if you're right or left-handed with a knife and all that, but to be honest, it doesn't even matter if there is a line there in the first place. As long as you take a continuous shaving from this side, therefore indicating it's flat, you're absolutely fine. So let's do that now. And next we're going to use that square edge established on the shooting board to measure the remaining side. And of course, this is where you can scale the toolbox to whatever suits you. I think it's very easy to overdo these and make them not as portable as they should be. But then again, if you're not intending for it to be portable, hey, make it as big as you want. So I'm squaring this line up using that same face edge, as you can see from the marking there. Thus, all of this is going to be waste. Make it into some nice coasters or something. Probably won't, I'll just burn it. And then finally what we'll do is cut to that line on the bandsaw as close as you dare, probably about 1 millimeter away, and then plane down to that final length using the shooting board. Okay, then before we call an end to this part, we have got one final opportunity before marking out to choose what faces we want to be the outside. And by the way, I accidentally marked the wrong side on here. Fortunately, I noticed before cutting it out, but yeah, I've got a line there to contend with, which I'm going to need to clean up later. Now saying that, although you have a choice of which face you want to be up, you don't have a choice of which edge is at the bottom. Unfortunately, because both of these ends have been squared up using that edge, we're already kind of locked into that decision. So this has to be the bottom now where your face edge is. But let's flip this around, see what looks best. I've got a dark mark there, so I definitely want that one to be the inside. So a big mark on there, leading to our face edge. So on this one, yeah, I'm happy with that. Dark stain there, don't like that, that's going on the inside. Yeah, quite dark there, so let's make this the outside. We'll then get these numbered in the order in which we want them. I quite like that one there, because again, we've got that grain flow that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, reversing this one has kind of negated that effect, but that one's going to be the back, so that doesn't matter too much. So I'm happy with this. And we're going to label each join 1, 1, nice and big. 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, and 4 up this end. It's important you make those numbers nice and big because it's going to help you later when it comes to marking this out. You don't want to be hunting around for any small numbers or anything like that. Make them nice and big and clear. So let's get this stood up and see how it looks. It certainly looks like a box. I've checked all the sides of the same length and everything. We've got the orientation sorted. And so in the next episode, I'm going to talk you through marking out the mitered dovetails that are going to make up the carcass of this box, while also taking into account the material that's going to be lost when we separate the lid later on. There's quite a lot that goes into it. So even if you're confident at marking out dovetails, it's best not to skip this next section. So as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do not forget to press the like button below. Subscribe to the school if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next lesson.